Welcome to chapter 1 of your textbook. In this chapter, we will focus on organizations, and by the end of it, you should be able to define what an organization is. You need to know why they're important. You need to know the characteristics. You need to know the distinguishing features, the types, and objectives. And by the end of it, you should be able to answer all the chapter summary questions. Okay, so what is an organization? Well, to put it simply, an organization is a structured arrangement where two or more people work together to achieve a specific purpose. Now, within the definition, there's three key elements you need to know, and that is structured arrangement, two or more people, and purpose. If you're familiar with each of these elements, you won't have any issue understanding chapter 1. Now, as for the definition itself, it's a very broad and general definition. So that means that you could literally give hundreds of examples of what an organization could be, so long as, of course, they fit this criteria, these three elements. Let's do that now, and we'll start with your favorite organization, which is the school you go to. You also have multi-billion-dollar organizations like the ANZ, and you have powerful ones like the UN, you have important humanitarian ones like the Red Crescent, and then you have the not-so-humanitarian like the mafia, criminal organizations. Of course, you have terrorist organizations which come in many different forms and shapes. I don't have any pictures up there, I don't want to get too political, but you guys get the idea. I mean, there's a vast range you can see here. Now, in activity 1.1, what you need to do before our next class is look back over the past week or two and come up with a list of your own organizations that you've dealt with. And the idea with that is for you guys to see just how much organizations do impact our day-to-day life. Okay, so next question. Why do we need organizations? Why are they so important? The first reason why they're important is because it enables people to achieve things they could not do on their own. So if you were to look at this picture here, and in particular, if you were to look at this little guy right there, this little guy, he will have absolutely no chance of scaring this big fish away. And you'll also notice that even though there's more than one fish, they're still not able to scare this big guy away. And that's because they're still missing two important elements in our definition of organization, and that is structure and purpose. So as soon as you introduce structure and purpose, then all of a sudden you're achieving things there's no possible way you could do it on your own. Number 2. We need organizations because they enable the continuity of knowledge. So what does that mean, continuity of knowledge? Well, if you were to think of an organization as you would a family, it'll make a lot more sense. So for example, in a family, knowledge is always passed on from generation to generation. And it works the same way with an organization. And this is why it's so important. Because if you were on your own, all right, completely on your own, you had no family, no friends, okay? He's crying, okay? Then all that wonderful knowledge in that wonderful little brain of yours, it's actually going to live and die with you, all right? So this is why organizations are so important for this continuity. But it's not just for the continuity. If you think about it, organizations also help knowledge increase. And that's because two heads are always better than one. So when you're exchanging ideas, you're not just passing on knowledge, you're developing it, you're increasing it. Okay, and the third reason why we need organizations is because they serve to manage complex social and technological change. Now, to understand that, it's best to imagine someone working for themselves. Now, if they needed to implement advances in communication technology and constantly update that technology, that would be next to impossible to achieve that. And you're going to end up looking like this guy here. However, in an organization has the resources available to hire someone in that field to implement that change and to manage that change, and even to train other people on how to use it. And that's the advantage of organizations. And finally, the fourth reason is organizations are a fundamental source of employment. And this basically means that people need people. You can't achieve a big task without hiring someone to help you. And even if you did work for yourself, in some way, you still need an organization to help your business. So in reality, you just simply cannot get away with dealing with an organization. And that's why they're a fundamental source of employment. Okay, so moving on, what are the common characteristics of organizations? Now, the answer to this question is actually within the definition itself. Now, if you remember, the three key elements of an organization were the number of people, so 2 or more people, structure, and purpose. Now, the one that we want to focus on at the moment is structure. Okay. Now, structure means the way an organization is set up to achieve its goals. Now, you have 2 types of structures. You have what's called as an informal structure, and you have a formal structure. Now, in a formal structure, the rules, responsibilities, roles, and procedures, all of it is clearly defined, okay? Which means that there's no room for misinterpretation. So everyone knows exactly what to do. And generally speaking, when things are very defined, you have many classifications, many groupings. And when you have many groupings, you have many departments. And when you have many departments, you have what's known as a tall hierarchy, which looks something like that. There's many levels of authority. Now, conversely, with an informal structure, the rules, responsibilities, roles and procedures, all of that is not clearly defined. Now, you may be asking then, okay, so if it's not clearly defined, then how do people know what to do? Now, the answer to that question is because there's a lot of trust put in place. There's a lot of verbal agreement. Now, that's kind of risky, but the advantage of that is that things generally get done a lot more quickly because you have less levels of authority to go through. So you have a flat hierarchy. So again, things get done a lot more quickly. Okay, so the next question is, what are the key distinguishing features of an organization? Now, this question is basically asking, how are we able to differentiate between organizations? Or put another way, how can we compare between organizations? So the first way we can do that is through size. Now, size doesn't just mean the number of employees. It also means the revenue and the assets. Now, you do need to know what these terms mean. So, by revenue, we mean what the business earns from sales and fees. And assets means the items of monetary value that is owned by the business. The second distinguishing feature is the nature of operations, meaning how do the organizations operate. Now, basically, there's 2 ways they can operate, either for profit or not for profit. And we'll get into more detail on that in the next slide or two. But also, nature of operations refers to whether the organization is selling a physical product, so something you can actually touch. And we call that tangible items or goods. But you also have organizations that sell a service. Now, services are things that you can't really touch, okay? It's intangible. And a good example of that would be a travel agency. Now, with the travel agency, when they sell you a ticket overseas, they're actually selling you an experience, and you can't really touch an experience. So that's why we call it an intangible service. Now, the third distinguishing feature is legal ownership. And basically, that's just the way an organization is legally owned. So it can either be a sole trader or a partnership or a company. It can also be a trust as well. There's a few more there, and we'll get into more detail on those in chapter 4. The fourth distinguishing feature is market share. Now, by market share, we mean the percentage of total sales by a business within its industry. Now, this word industry is very important. Basically, what it means is a group of organizations that produce similar goods and services. A good example of that would be the beverage industry. And a classic example would be comparing Coke and Pepsi. Now, the way we compare is by looking at the market share. So which one of these has more market share? Is it Coke or Pepsi? And finally, the fifth distinguishing feature is what's known as GDP, or Gross Domestic Product. Now, this is the total monetary value of outputs produced in a year. So basically, the higher the GDP, the more healthier the economy. And what the government does with this GDP is it looks into the industries and sees how they're contributing to the economy. So they've actually grouped these industries into what's known as key industry sectors. So this is how they know which industry is performing well. They look at GDP and they see what's their contribution. Now, this is very important for organizations because it helps them in two ways. The first way is that it helps them make better decisions within the organization. Now, the key question is how. Now, let's go back to Pepsi. Let's assume that Pepsi wasn't doing so well. Their profit was going down compared to the previous year. But they noticed that within the industry, the government report has come out saying that the beverage industry is doing really well. Now, that helps the organization or Pepsi in this case, because it means that they can't blame their performance on the industry. It's not an industry problem. It's actually an organizational problem. And that means that Pepsi now has an opportunity to maybe change its strategy because they know what's going on. It's an internal problem. And the other way these key industry sectors can help is by the government actually helping industries that need assistance. So for those industries that aren't doing so well, the government can now maybe perhaps provide financial assistance or maybe change some of its laws and policies. So you can see here why these key industry sectors are so important for organizations. Okay, so here are the 17 major industry sectors that the government has grouped. Now, you need to use this information here for activity 1.2, which you need to do before our next class. Now, basically, all you have to do here is find out which industry sector these organizations belong. Now, the first two have been done for you. So, for example, Myer belongs to the retail trade. And some of these are pretty easy. Melbourne Water, you know right away, that's going to be the electricity, gas and water supply. And the University of Melbourne, that's going to be the education industry. Now, some of these you may not know. For example, Grocon or Wesfarmers, in which case the textbook does say if you want to, you can go to the Australian Stock Exchange website. Here, you just have to go to Prices and Research, Company Information, and from here you can find your organization, and it's got it listed here, and the industry classification as well. Now, here they've actually classified the industries a little bit different to what's in the textbook, but if you can't find it or you're not sure, you can always go to Professor Google. Now, again, you need to do activity 1.2 before our next class. Now, every organization has two goals, or two main goals, I should say. And they are financial and social. Now, with financial goals, we mean when organizations want to seek a profit. And social goals basically means when organizations want to service the community in some way. Now, if you remember in the previous slide or the one before that, we mentioned NFP organizations and FP organizations. Now, you would be forgiven to assume that FP organizations are only concerned about financial goals, and NFPs are only concerned about social goals. But in reality, it doesn't actually paint a complete picture. In reality, the way it works is, although FPs are mainly concerned about financial goals, social goals are still very relevant to FPs. And although NFPs are mainly concerned about social goals, financial goals are still very relevant to NFPs. So you can see here that regardless of what type of organization it is, financial goals and social goals will always play a role somehow, okay? And this is very important to remember. And we'll explore this in more detail over the next two slides. Okay, so the number one goal of FP organizations is maximum profit. And I really need to emphasize maximum profit here, because for an FP organization to go into business, it would make no sense for them to do that if it means that they're only going to be earning, let's say, for example, $2 per week. That's not very worthwhile. So the return on investment needs to be enough so that it actually attracts investors. Now, the other feature with maximum profit is the fact that the profit is owned by the owners and shareholders. Now, usually with FP organizations, the profit is reinvested, or at least a portion of that is reinvested back into the business. But the profit that remains with them is theirs to use as they please. Now, that may be obvious to you, but the same cannot be said for NFPs. With NFPs, there's no such thing as a profit. So what they call that, if there's some funds left over after all expenses are paid, they call that surplus. And that surplus has to be put back into the organization. Now, let's say, for example, a company director of a NFP was using the surplus for his own personal gain. Let's say he was buying Lamborghinis with that surplus. That's actually illegal. He could quite possibly go to jail for that, because NFPs, legally, the surplus has to go back into the organization because their purpose is to service the community. Now, the second goal is market growth. Now, market growth is interesting because market growth is all about attaining a larger customer base. Now, in order to do that, sometimes what they do is they decrease their profit margins in order to attract more customers. And when they attract more customers, they increase the market share. with the hope that eventually it's going to lead to greater total profit. Now, a good example of explaining that is to look at the example of Virgin Blue Airlines and Qantas. Now, when Virgin Blue Airlines came into the market, Qantas had most of the market share. So what Virgin Blue Airlines needed to do was they needed to sell their ticket prices for a lot cheaper. So that meant that their profit margins per ticket sold would have been, let's say, for example, only 15%, whereas Qantas would have been earning a lot more per ticket sold. Now, this kind of goes against maximum profit, at least initially. But the idea here was that if Virgin Blue Airlines was to sell a lot more tickets, let's say, for example, a lot more, whatever number that is, then eventually, they're going to be earning their maximum profit. So this is what market growth is all about, increasing the customer base. Now, with NFPs, they have to consider market growth as well, because if they're not securing funds from membership or government support or community donations or sponsorship, that means some other similar NFP is going to be doing that. So they need to be active and get that market growth. And finally, the third goal for FP organizations is growth. Now, growth is a combination of both profit and market growth. But with growth, it's mainly concerned about the longevity. So it wants to ensure that it's going to stick around for a long time. Now, the way they do that is instead of just trying to decrease their prices to gain a larger market share, what they may do is they may introduce new products and services. So this is one way of increasing the growth of the organization. And again, you can look at Virgin Blue Airlines for this. So let's say, for example, when they came into the market, they were introducing national flights, so flights just within Australia. However, if they were to consider growth, they would need to consider maybe introducing new flights, let's say, for example, internationally, so flights to maybe Asia and places like that. So that's one way of growing the business. Now, again, NFPs need to consider growth as well, because if they're introducing new services, then that means that potentially there's room for more surplus. And NFPs need to consider this because more surplus means they're better able to meet its social goals. Okay, so we've seen how profit, market share, and growth is relevant to NFPs. And in much the same way, social goals are also relevant to FP organizations as well. Now, what are social goals? Social goals, basically, they benefit both the employee and wider community. In what way? Well, firstly, FP organizations, what they're doing now is they're providing training and employment opportunities for the disadvantaged. Now, the disadvantaged could be the youth, migrants, and those with criminal records. Now, the textbook does mention transport company Toll Holdings. Now, what these guys have actually done was every year they reserve a certain number of employee positions for those with a minor criminal record. Now, what that does is it gives these people a second chance. Now, that doesn't really benefit Toll Holdings in terms of their profit, but it does benefit them in other ways. For example, by giving people a second chance, they're actually promoting a good image of Toll Holdings, the company. And also, at least theoretically, by giving people a second chance, you're helping produce a more loyal and productive workforce, because someone given a second chance wants to actually work for you. They want to be loyal to you, and they want to actually work hard because of that second chance that you gave them. And finally, it actually benefits the community as well, because if these guys are taking people off the street, because they now have a job, then they're no longer committing crime, so the streets are a lot safer. So you can see here that by implementing social goals, it's actually a win-win both for the company and the wider community. Now, the second social goal that's being implemented now is the environment. So for-profit organizations are now becoming a lot more environmentally conscious. And that's because consumers are now more educated, meaning they want to buy environmentally friendly products. So if they're not being ethical and socially responsible, that means companies are going to be missing out on a lot of the market share. So they have to be environmentally conscious as well. Now, the textbook gives an example of the Body Shop, and it talks about how they're committed to fair trade suppliers. But if you go to their website, you'll see that they're committed to a lot more than that. But there's actually many other examples you could give. So, for example, a big company like Coles, they're now responded to community pressure on the caged eggs. If you look at those factories, if you've seen those images, then you know what I'm talking about. So Coles is now introducing a policy that has no caged eggs on their shelves. So it's a cage-free eggs policy. And Woolworths is actually introducing in fact, the same campaign as well. Now, finally, you have what's known as secure employment and career development. Organizations have to have some type of bonus scheme and some type of career development program, because if they're not introducing these policies, then they're not going to attract really good talent to their organization. So if they want to attract that talent, they have to make sure that their organization is socially friendly. So you can see here that social goals is again influencing the way FP organizations are doing business. Okay, so you guys should now be able to answer each of these questions, and if need be, read the chapter again. But you need to answer these questions before the next online revision quiz and before the next class, because you need to be able to contribute to class discussion, which does remind me you need to also do activity 1.1 and 1.2. Now, I want to emphasize the importance of doing these questions before the next class and before the next quiz, because these same questions are on the quiz. So if you want to understand the content, if you want a really good score in the quiz as well as the exam, do these questions at the right time. Okay, so that's it for chapter 1.